Imagine this. It's 3 a.m. You're asleep in your apartment in Moscow. Your wife is next to you. Your kids are in the next room. Then, a knock on the door. Not a soft knock, a hard, official knock. The kind that doesn't stop until you open. You already know who it is. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police. You have about 30 seconds to say goodbye to your family. You don't know where they're taking you. You don't know if you'll ever come back. And the worst part? You have no idea what you did wrong. This happened to hundreds of thousands of people across the Soviet Union between 1936 and 1938. Some were generals. Some were Communist Party members who had been loyal for decades. Some were farmers. Some were teachers. Some were neighbors who someone decided to report. This was Stalin's Great Purge. And by the time it was over 750,000 people were dead, and millions more were sent to the Gulag, the brutal Soviet prison camp system. Today, I'm going to break down exactly how this happened, why it happened, and what it tells us about power, fear, and human nature. Let's go.
To understand the Great Purge, you first have to understand who Stalin was and what drove him. Stalin was not born into power. He was a Georgian-born revolutionary who clawed his way up through the Communist Party after Lenin's death in 1924. By 1929, 5 years after Lenin died, Stalin had outmaneuvered every rival and declared himself the effective dictator of the Soviet Union. But here's the thing about men like Stalin. The more power they have, the more terrified they are of losing it. Stalin genuinely believed, or at least convinced himself, that there were enemies everywhere. Inside the Communist Party, inside the military, inside his own cabinet. People who were secretly working against him, secretly plotting to overthrow him, secretly collaborating with Nazi Germany or the West. And in the 1930s, with Adolf Hitler rising in Germany and threatening the Soviet Union, that paranoia went into overdrive. Stalin needed total, absolute, unquestioned control, and he was willing to destroy anyone, friend or enemy, to get it.
December 1st, 1934. Leningrad, Soviet Union. A man named Sergei Kirov is walking through the hallway of Communist Party headquarters. Kirov was one of the most powerful and popular men in the Soviet Union, second only to Stalin himself. He was charismatic. People loved him. And that's exactly the problem. A man named Leonid Nikolaev approached Kirov in that hallway and shot him dead. The official story? A lone gunman, a personal grudge, case closed. But historians have argued for decades that Stalin himself ordered the assassination because Kirov's death gave Stalin exactly what he needed, an excuse. Within days, Stalin declared that dangerous anti-Soviet conspiracies were everywhere. He pushed through emergency laws, allowing suspected enemies of the state to be arrested, tried, and executed, without proper legal process. The purge had officially begun. And Stalin used it to go after people he had wanted to eliminate for years, starting with his oldest political rivals. This is where things get genuinely disturbing. Starting in 1936, Stalin began holding what became known as the Moscow show trials. These were public trials, broadcast on radio, reported in newspapers around the world, where some of the most powerful and respected men in the Soviet Union were brought out and accused of the most outrageous crimes. Plotting to murder Stalin, collaborating with Nazi Germany, sabotaging Soviet industry, working for foreign intelligence agencies. And almost every single defendant, men who had been revolutionary heroes, men who had helped build the Soviet Union, stood up and confessed, publicly, in front of cameras. How? Because the NKVD had spent weeks, sometimes months, breaking them down. Sleep deprivation, psychological torture, threats against their families. Some were promised their lives would be spared if they cooperated.
Most were executed anyway. Lev Kamenev, Grigory Zinoviev, Nikolai Bukharin. These were men Lenin himself had worked with, men who had been Bolshevik heroes. And Stalin had them all killed, while making them publicly humiliate themselves first. There's a phrase one former Soviet official used that I think captures this perfectly. The problem with getting rid of God is that a man takes his place. Stalin wasn't just eliminating rivals. He was erasing the entire generation of old Bolsheviks who knew the real history of the revolution, who remembered that Stalin wasn't as central as he claimed to be. Dead men can't contradict your version of history. The Moscow trials were public, but most of the killing happened in secret. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, was essentially Stalin's personal death squad, led first by Genrikh Yagoda, then by Nikolai Yezhov, a man so feared that this entire period is sometimes called the Yezhovshchina, the era of Yezhov. Here's how it worked. Stalin would sign what were called execution lists, literal lists with names on them. He reviewed them personally. He approved them. Sometimes he would add names in the margins. Sometimes he would write notes next to names. Shoot. Arrest family. Historians have found over 380 of these lists, signed by Stalin and other Politburo members, authorizing the execution of nearly 44,000 people. And those are just the ones we have records of. The NKVD worked through the night, every night. People were arrested, interrogated, and executed, sometimes within 24 hours. Bodies were buried in mass graves that weren't discovered until decades later. The most infamous of these killing sites was Butovo, on the outskirts of Moscow. Between 1937 and 1938, over 20,000 people were executed there, shot in the back of the head, buried in long trenches. The NKVD called these operations the highest measure of social protection. They called it social protection. Now, here's one of the most insane parts of this whole story. While Nazi Germany was rearming at full speed, while Hitler was building the most powerful military force in European history, Stalin was busy destroying his own army. In June 1937, Stalin had Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky arrested. Tukhachevsky was arguably the most brilliant military mind in the Soviet Union. He had modernized the Red Army. He understood modern warfare. He was shot 8 days after his arrest. Over the next year, Stalin purged roughly 35,000 officers from the Red Army, 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, 50 out of 57 corps commanders. Think about that for a second. He wiped out the entire leadership of his military. And when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the result was catastrophic. The Red Army was leaderless, disorganized. In some areas, entire divisions surrendered or collapsed within days. Stalin's paranoia didn't protect the Soviet Union. It nearly destroyed it. The Soviet Union eventually won World War II, but historians estimate that the military purges directly contributed to the deaths of millions of additional Soviet soldiers in the first years of the war. Here's what most people don't realize about the Great Purge. It wasn't just politicians and generals. Ordinary people disappeared too. And the criteria for arrest were terrifying in their vagueness. You could be arrested for telling a joke about Stalin, owning a foreign book, having a relative who'd emigrated, being from a certain ethnic group. Stalin specifically targeted Polish, German, and Korean minorities living inside the USSR, or simply being reported by a neighbor who wanted your apartment. The NKVD had quotas. Regional commanders were given target numbers, how many enemies of the state they needed to find and arrest. So investigators would arrest people just to meet their numbers. And once you were arrested, confession was almost guaranteed. The interrogation methods were brutal. Sleep deprivation, beatings, threats to arrest your spouse, your children. People confessed to things they never did, just to make it stop. Soviet archives opened after the fall of the USSR revealed that of the 1.5 million people arrested during the Great Terror, roughly 750,000 were executed. The other 750,000 were sent to the Gulag, where hundreds of thousands more died from overwork, starvation, and cold.
The Great Purge officially ended in November 1938. Stalin had Yezhov, his chief executioner, arrested, then executed. He was erased from official photographs. The regime that had used him now pretended he never existed. Even the executioner wasn't safe. What did the purge actually accomplish? Stalin had total, unchallenged power. There was no one left to question him, contradict him, or threaten him. Every institution, the party, the military, the government, the media, was staffed with people who owed their positions entirely to Stalin and were terrified of him. But it came at an enormous cost. The Soviet Union entered World War II militarily weakened. Its best military minds were dead. Its best engineers and scientists had been imprisoned or killed. The country's intellectual class had been decimated. And the psychological damage to Soviet society lasted for generations. Families didn't talk about relatives who had been purged, because even mentioning them was dangerous. Children grew up not knowing what happened to their fathers, their grandparents. The Soviet Union eventually acknowledged the Great Purge under Khrushchev in the 1950s, calling it Stalin's crimes against the party. But full disclosure of the truth didn't come until the 1990s, when Soviet archives were finally opened. Here's what I want you to walk away with. The Great Purge wasn't random. It was systematic. It was organized. And it was carried out by thousands of ordinary people. Guards, interrogators, clerks, informants, following orders. The philosopher Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a bureaucrat filling out paperwork. Stalin killed over 750,000 of his own people in 2 years. Not foreign enemies, his own citizens, his own party members, his own generals. And he did it because power without accountability always ends the same way. If you found this video valuable, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the history that shaped our world. And drop a comment. Do you think Stalin's paranoia was genuine, or was it all calculated? I read every single one. I'll see you in the next one.